Hello, everybody. It's always weird in webinar. I don't see you, but I know you're out there and I welcome you. And again, my name is Michelle Whitty. I am the Executive Director of the League of Women Voters of Minnesota. And so excited to be here tonight with a fellow League member who also has many other credentials and wonderful information to share with us. But I did want to start out with just a little bit about the League and this topic for those of you who might be new to the League or would know a little bit that, the League was started in 1919 after the 19th Amendment was passed. That expanded voting rights for women. And actually, on the opening plank of importance after the vote was secured, women had right on their program with Carrie Chapman Catt in the room here in Minneapolis, the civil status of women on their agenda. It took 72 years to get the vote, and then the fight for women's rights has been ongoing. So while there is a lot of movement, obviously, that has happened in the last 105 years, tonight we are going to talk a little bit about the backsliding we're seeing. So, and again, the League of Women Voters is nonpartisan, as is the agency that Ellen will be talking about tonight, World Without Genocide. We do not endorse or oppose political candidates or parties, but we are not neutral on issues. We study and take action on important issues that are not partisan. Certainly, a world without genocide is not partisan, and women's rights are not partisan. So we look forward to educating you a little bit about kind of the global perspective as well tonight. Another thing the League of Women Voters has been very active on is active with the United Nations since the beginning. We have observers there. We're very active, and we don't often get to see that. So I'm really excited myself to hear all the great information that Ellen has to share tonight. So some of you might have also seen, I worked with Kelsey Waits, president of AAW, who did we did a Star Tribune editorial together. And the title of it was Try as the Trump Administration Might, It Can't Erase Women. And that is really at the heart of what this is tonight. We talked about the fact that over 200 words have been sort of stricken from federal documents, and those include words like women and female and rights. So we know how important and pivotal this moment is. I often say, fear and learning, sometimes we get fearful, but fear, understanding issues that might make us fearful, mobilize us to action. And then hope sustains us. And so tonight we're going to learn, but then also have that hope that action has consistently moved rights forward. While we're in a backsliding moment, there are many things we can all do to hang together and continue to see the growth of women's rights, which are human rights. So I want to welcome again Ellen Kennedy, who's a fabulous member from our LWV-Edina. So glad that you're a member, Ellen. And she's also the founder and executive director of World Without Genocide, a human rights organization located right here in St. Paul, Minnesota. And she has received lots of recognition for her human rights work, including the Outstanding Citizen Award from the Anne Frank Center, which I think is really quite an honor, among many other wonderful honors that we have on our web page for this event about her. But as relates to tonight, she is a representative of the United Nations Department of Global Communications. World Without Genocide received a special consultative status to the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations in 2022. So Ellen's been around, she's seen things, and has a lot of wisdom to impart. So again, tonight, she will talk about that UN 69th Commission on the status of women, a gathering of 9,000 people from around the world. That has to have been spectacular to address women's rights and talk about the linkage between today's increasing de-democratization in Europe and the US, and unfortunately rise in misogyny, sexual violence, women's electoral disenfranchisement, and growing gender inequality. But again, we're going to end on on a hopeful note with how we can still continue to make sure that women are not erased in our government. So we want to welcome Ellen. Yay. Thank you, Ellen, for being here. You all, as usual, in a webinar setting, we don't have the chat running. We want everyone to stay kind of focused on what's going on, but the Q&A is open for your questions. So please pop questions into the Q&A and we will answer those at the right time. All right, Ellen, thanks again and welcome.
I'm thrilled to be here, Michelle. Thank you so much. I want to give thanks as well to Maggie O'Brien, who is running this evening's webinar for us, and to Randy Markison, Associate Director at World Without Genocide, who will facilitate a conversation with Michelle and with me as time allows as we conclude our formal part of the program. I want to begin by describing a little bit about what life was like when I was a little girl. I grew up in a small iron ore mining town in northern Michigan. I don't remember many of the moms working outside of the home, as the phrase went. There were no women lawyers or doctors, engineers or professors that I was aware of. The women who did work were nurses, elementary school teachers, secretaries, or they worked in a retail setting. I had a few women high school teachers, but I never had a woman teacher in science or in math, only English and a French teacher. Even in college, I went to the University of Michigan. I never had a woman professor, and my mom didn't work outside of the home. Today, a generation later, it's totally different. Women's lives can be whatever we wish them to be. My women cousins and I are professors, lawyers, doctors, whatever we choose. Our daughters and our granddaughters have almost unlimited wonderful choices in front of them. And many men are terrified that it's no longer a man's world, and they want their world back. This is the backlash. Misogynists are reshaping political institutions in an effort to return power and control to men. And the way they're doing this is to take away women's rights and women's autonomy. This is Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, and he calls this backlash the poison of patriarchy, and he says it is led by the masters of misogyny. And interestingly, a decline in women's rights almost always occurs with a corresponding decline in democracy. And we must think about these two factors together. Right now, there's a decline in democracy around the globe. Gender equality is stalling or going backwards for 1 billion women and girls, and that includes women and girls in the United States. Between 2019 and 2022, nearly 40% of all countries home to those 1 billion women and girls stagnated or declined on gender equality. How long must women wait for equality? If current trends continue, UN experts say that equality will not be achieved until the 22nd century. The critical question is, why is this situation getting worse? Why does there seem to be a war on women? In many ways, it's pretty simple. Women have believed that we can do it, and we have made progress on so many fronts. Let's look at some of that progress. The percent of college students who are women, 58%. Women have outnumbered men among college students for decades, but the gap is widening considerably. In 1979, about 200,000 more women were enrolled in college than men, 200,000. By 2021, that difference had grown to 3.2 million more women than men in college. The percent of law school students who are women, 56%. In 2025, women probably will be a majority of full-time faculty members at American Bar Association accredited law schools. A majority. Just imagine. The percent of medical school students who are women, 55%. My dad went to medical school. In his graduating class in 1936, there was one woman. And look at this, all the seats that are being held by women in colleges across the country, in law schools and in medical schools, the majority of those seats are held by women. And now the masters of misogyny want those seats back. Women had major corporations, universities, and states. 12 women currently serve as governors. Women are astronauts, Nobel scientists, record-breaking athletes. Women work on construction crews, police forces, and they're firefighters. Women at this moment can be almost anything that we want to be. Think back to the rioters on January 6th. Many of them were particularly enraged against Nancy Pelosi. She was the Speaker of the US House of Representatives. She was second in line for the presidency of the United States after the vice president. She had a huge amount of power as a woman, something that many men, especially white misogynist men, found deeply threatening. And the man shown in this picture was sentenced in 2023 to 54 months in prison for his role in that insurrection on January 6th. He rested his feet on the desk in Nancy Pelosi's office. He was pardoned by Trump on January 20th, 2025. He was pardoned on Trump's very first day in office. I'm going to describe the situation for women in the US, and then I'll highlight the laws that are moving us backwards at a breathtaking and heartbreaking pace. And I want to say a word about words. When I say women, I mean women, girls, gender-expansive people, and other vulnerable minorities who are affected in many of the same ways. How to attack women's equality is to attack our bodily autonomy, our human right to make choices about our very being. And that is exactly what is happening. Let's begin with contraception. Millions of US women seek and use contraception. However, many women face financial, geographic, and social barriers in trying to access contraception. It can depend on the state where a woman or girl lives, where she resides even within a state, her employment status, her insurance, and more. And the consequences of a lack of access to contraception are significant. About 99% of sexually active women will use some form of contraception during their lifetime. And yet about 19 million women of reproductive age live in counties that are called contraceptive deserts. Those contraceptive deserts give women no access to a health center with a full range of contraceptive methods. And the backlash. On April 1st, 2025, the current administration slashed funding for reproductive health clinics in 20 states. And this included a federal program to help low-income people access birth control, cancer screenings, and other essential elements for reproductive health care. The United States Supreme Court will hear a case which, if decided for the plaintiffs, could result in employers and insurers fully denying employee coverage for birth control. And for many employees, health insurance through employment is the only option that they have for obtaining affordable contraception. Other options. Congressional legislation was proposed to try to protect the right to obtain and use contraceptives and to prevent states from banning contraception. But the bills don't have enough support to pass in Congress. So there will not be, in 2025, any federal protection for the right to obtain and use contraceptives. In 2024, 8 states enacted or proposed restrictions at the state level on access to contraceptives. It's not only contraceptives. Many women face severe restrictions on access to alternate methods of conception, known as assisted reproductive technology. And this includes intrauterine insemination, IUI, in vitro fertilization, IVF, egg or sperm donation, and surrogacy. And again, there's great variation across US states in availability, in procedures, legality, enforceability of contracts, and access to these alternate methods of conception, limiting women's bodily autonomy and their right to choose. Fully 2% of all babies born in the US were conceived through IVF. And yet US senators have blocked legislation to guarantee women's access to IVF and to other fertility treatments. Private insurers in 29 states are now not mandated to cover IVF treatment. And without that insurance coverage, a single IVF cycle can cost between $15,000 and $20,000. Since 2022 and the overturning of Roe v. Wade, the federal right to abortion, abortion policies are now set by states. And we know that in many states, there are very severe restrictions on access to safe, affordable, and legal terminations of pregnancy, even in cases of rape, incest, or risk to the mother's health. Around 22 million reproductive age women and girls live in states where abortion is heavily restricted or unavailable. Those are the states that are shown in a map in darkest orange. States protecting abortion rights are primarily those states that are not in the southeast part of the country. And that includes Minnesota with protection for abortion rights. People with limited financial means are overrepresented in seeking abortions, largely because they are originally unable to have adequate access to contraception. They subsequently often cannot overcome geographic, legal, and financial barriers for access to safe termination. Abortion is now illegal in 12 states, with several of these states imposing both civil and criminal penalties. 10 states in the US have introduced legislation to make abortion a felony punishable by the death penalty. At the federal level, the 1994 US Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances Act, known by its acronym as the FACE Act, protected access to reproductive health clinics. Let me say the name of it again. Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances Act. It criminalized demonstrators who tried to block entrances, who damaged property, or who threatened patients, and it criminalized this with both civil and criminal penalties. Between 1977 and 2022, there were 11 murders, 42 bombings, 531 assaults, and 492 invasions of reproductive health clinics, among thousands of other criminal activities directed at abortion providers, patients, and volunteers. And now this act has been scaled way back by the current administration. On January 23rd, 2025, Trump granted full pardons to 23 people who previously had been convicted under the FACE Act. 2 days later, the Justice Department stated that only in, quote, extraordinary circumstances, unquote, will demonstrators be prosecuted. The Department of Justice was ordered to drop 3 pending actions involving clinic blockades in Ohio, Tennessee, and Pennsylvania. So this means that women and girls who are trying to access these clinics can no longer do so safely. They are in grave danger because the protection through the FACE Act will not be enforced by the current administration. Transgender people comprise 0.6% of the US population ages 13 and older. Let me say that again, 0.6%, 0.6 of 1% of the population. It's 1.6 million people. And despite the small proportion, state legislatures have expended vast resources to limit and restrict medical care, particularly gender-affirming care for transgender and gender-expansive people. Lawmakers in several states have introduced bills to limit gender-affirming care for adults, including proposals to prohibit federal Medicaid coverage for lower-income people of gender transition services. They want to prevent state or county health professionals from providing it, and they want to bar the use of public money to pay for such care for persons who are incarcerated. In 10 states, Medicaid policies now exclude transgender-related health care for people of all ages. In 27 states, medical care is banned or restricted for transgender youth. Without insurance coverage, gender-affirming treatment costs are prohibitive for most people. 1 in 2 transgender people have reported mistreatment by a healthcare provider, including care refusal and verbal or physical abuse. Over 20% of transgender people postpone care due to a fear of discrimination during treatment. The American Civil Liberties Union reports at least 23 cases currently being litigated for discriminatory treatment or for refusal by healthcare providers to render necessary or even emergency care to transgender or gender-expansive people. People across the US currently lack protection from domestic violence and from domestic abuse. Women in the US experience epidemic rates of sexual and gender-based violence. And I'm going to share some truly horrifying statistics. 1 in 4 college women will be sexually assaulted. 2 million people, women, girls, gender expansive people, report injuries from intimate partners. Women constitute 96% of the victims of intimate partner murder-suicides. 1 out of every 5 women in the US has been a victim of an attempted or a completed rape. Every 68 seconds, a person in the US is sexually assaulted. On average, 463,634 victims of sexual assault and rape occur each year. 63,000 children a year were victims of sexual abuse between 2009 and 2013. Of victims under age 18, 34% are under age 12. And women of color are at an elevated risk of violence from the intersection of race, class, and gender. Half of Black women are subjected to coercive sexual contact by age 18. 4 in 10 Black women have reported intimate partner violence in their lifetimes. 40% of confirmed sex trafficking victim survivors are Black. Indigenous people in the US face sexual violence at twice the rate of other racial groups. 5,487 Indigenous women and girls were reported missing in 2022, the most recent year for up-to-date data. Transgender and gender-expansive people are victimized by sexual and gender-based assault. In 2023, 32 US transgender women died from gun and interpersonal violence. 84% were people of color. 54% of those people of color were Black, in an intersection of transphobia, misogyny, and racism. From 2013 to 2023, there were at least 335 transgender and gender nonconforming victims of fatal violence. Now let's think about the response. Beginning during Trump's first term, #MeToo, a global social movement against sexual assault by predatory males, launched legal cases and attempted takedowns of powerful men, including Trump, who was found guilty of sexual abuse. Advocates for victims of sexual violence have suggested that his re-election and his cabinet picks perhaps are a sign of backlash against the #MeToo movement, which was an effort to hold powerful men accountable for violence against women. In addition to the cabinet picks with this known history of sexual violence and assault, the executive branch seems to be using executive orders in what seems like revenge against holding men accountable for sexual and gender-based violence. And what do I mean by that? These executive orders in the last 101 days have eliminated funding, programs, information, and services for assault victim survivors in an unprecedented slashing of support for women, girls, and gender expansive people. What Michelle is referring to as an erasure, not only an erasure of words about them, about us, but an erasure of the services to protect, to safeguard, and to provide rehabilitation. Millions of dollars have been frozen in virtually all areas related to women's safety, success, and well-being. Elon Musk's staff is slashing staff at Head Start, at the Office of Child Care. We know that the executive orders against DEI have harmed the rights of millions of women and non-white people, basically harming everyone but white men everywhere, from federal agencies to college campuses to services for victim survivors. Rules and regulations intended to promote fairness for groups that have long been disadvantaged in the workplace, in housing, in hospitals and schools are all gone. And federal workers charged with overseeing those DEI policies are gone as well. But it's not just policies intended to benefit women that are being abolished. Even those that seem neutral affect women more than men. The Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, or food stamps, is on the chopping block, and the majority of the adult recipients are female. 40% of the beneficiaries are children, another very vulnerable group. Trump's attempt to limit or to abolish the Affordable Care Act, known as Obamacare, and Medicaid will directly harm women because they are the majority of the recipients. The Affordable Care Act also covers birth control, no copay gynecological and preventive care, and pre-existing conditions. And it's hard to imagine, but pregnancy comes under that label of a pre-existing condition. The Trump administration eliminated the Gender Policy Council in the first week in office. Now, what is the Gender Policy Council, or what was it? It was established to promote gender equity and to coordinate federal efforts to combat systemic discrimination, to increase women's economic security, to increase women's access to more comprehensive health care, to address caregiving needs, and more. It has been completely shut down since that first week in office. The Trump administration has attacked transgender, intersex, and non-binary individuals. On the very first day, Trump signed an executive order. Michelle referenced all of those executive orders. On that first day, one of those executive orders now allows the federal government to control and regulate gender, encouraging discrimination by the government itself against transgender people, affirming that there are only two genders. The order subjects all individuals to suspicion and surveillance of their gender and invites actions against those who do not conform within this narrow understanding of binary gender roles. There is also an effort to eliminate transgender people from the military, where they constitute less than 1% of those in active service. And it's not only to eliminate transgender people from service, but a similar effort is also being made to eliminate women from certain areas of service as well. Today, women constitute 18% of the active duty military force of the United States. This overreach of the executive branch is the backlash against women's progress which is being perceived as a direct threat by some men to men's control. How does this situation compare to some of the countries in Europe? The status of women in the US relative to women in other Western nations is less than desirable. We rank at fair, below our Western counterparts, who rank as either very good or good. And the harsh backlash against women's rights in the US is happening from some factors that either don't exist to the same extent in our Western European countries, or they might not exist at all. And I want to talk about those factors. The single most important factor is that the US Constitution lacks federal protection for women's rights, and this makes women vulnerable to attacks. It also makes it easy for states to pass discriminatory laws, which I've indicated. Most European countries have protections and rights for women explicitly written into their constitutions. In fact, 85% of all UN member states, 85% have explicit constitutional provisions that prohibit discrimination on the basis of sex and or gender. And for those of you who are here with us online, those states are all shown in blue. Of all states, member states of the UN, with constitutions adopted since the year 2000, every one of them acknowledges equality. France even amended their older constitution to add that important recognition. The US has general equality as a guarantee, but gender is not mentioned in our Constitution. And at a global level, the United States has not ratified conventions or treaties that affirms women's equality. And I contend that we have not done that on purpose. The first one that I want to mention is the United Nations Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. The acronym is comprised of the letters CEDAW, Convention Elimination Discrimination Against Women. It's pronounced CEDAW. CEDAW has been ratified by all but 6 nations on the planet. And those 6 nations, Sudan, Somalia, Iran, Palau, Tonga, and the United States. CEDAW is known as a Bill of Rights for Women, and it enshrines women's equality in all areas of public life, and yet the US has failed to ratify it. The US is the only country on the planet that has not ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And this UN convention also affirms the right to people's bodily autonomy. Similarly, the United States has been unable to pass an equal rights amendment in the United States. The first national ERA bill was actually introduced in 1923, 102 years ago, and it's been reintroduced almost every year thereafter. It has yet to be passed. And states throughout the country have ratified it, but not enough for passage. And again, states in the southeast part of the United States are holding up this effort to try to legislate national equal rights for women. An option that many states have pursued is to try to pass a state-level ERA bill. We've had one pending in the state of Minnesota for 11 years. We can't get a state-level ERA passed either, and that would guarantee rights and equality for women in our own state. Many states have passed state-level legislation, but Minnesota is one of those in which efforts are underway year after year after year. Again, for those of you online, states in blue have state-level passage. Another issue that is becoming of grave concern has to do with social media. Social media platforms amplify harmful stereotypes and misogynistic content about women. This contributes to the backlash against women's rights. It feeds into potentially angry and hostile young men and older men, encouraging them to act in ways that might jeopardize women's safety, security, and equality. And this violent and hateful content mobilization can silence women from trying to raise their voices. Again, Europe is different. The European Union passed something called the Digital Services Act. This is legislation that regulates social media platforms to combat harmful online content. Europe has a far less expansive approach to free speech than the US. And of course, there are pros and cons to these issues. But in Europe, these limits are put in place to protect people's safety, their security, and also their dignity. So we see significant differences in the very constitutions themselves, in the federal protections for equality, in the digital protections for security, safety, and dignity. Another issue is what women's organizations are or are not able to do. Women's organizations in the US are underfunded, period. I think almost every women's organization would agree with that statement. And that makes it difficult to advocate as effectively as women's organizations might wish for women's rights, particularly in the face of strong, well-financed opposition by organizations that have the ability to generate a louder voice. Women's organizations in the US rely heavily on philanthropic funding from foundations and from individual donors. In Europe, however, there is government funding, and very significantly, there is funding from the European Union for women's rights initiatives. This can make a significant difference. Jim Crow racism in the United States. particularly in the southern and southeastern states that I have mentioned several times, effectively have kept people of color, both men and women, from the polls and from civil and economic life. And there are always efforts to limit voting by people of color in the United States through gerrymandering and other restrictive policies. And the League of Women Voters is actively engaged on many fronts with these issues. When voting can be restricted, voices are silenced. And when those voices are silenced, civil rights in all areas are weakened. And this particular issue of the legacy of Jim Crow segregation does not pose that kind of threat throughout Europe. After World War II, many European nations incorporated gender equality into their constitutions and legal frameworks, as I've mentioned, which the United States has refused to do with either the ERA or with ratification of something like CEDAW. In many European countries, women have higher rates of participation in the workforce, which contributes overall to their economic empowerment and their greater social influence. Now, how does this happen? It's possible because of robust government-funded social policies, including childcare and paid parental leave, that support a woman's ability to balance work and family life. The US is the only Western nation with no mandated federal paid parental leave. Many European countries also give women more expensive access to health care and to education compared to the US. The principle of gender equality is deeply ingrained in the values of the 27-nation European Union, and that becomes reflected in the policies and the legislation that the European Union puts forward. Countries that oppose those policies are under great pressure from EU legislators for change. Countries like Hungary, for example. Europe has a strong history of feminist movements that have advocated for women's rights and have challenged traditional gender roles, as have we in the United States. But public opinion surveys in Europe, compared to those in the US, suggest that in many European countries, there's greater support for legislative protections for gender equality compared to in the US. Many European countries have laws in place to address gender-based violence, ensure equal pay, and to protect women's reproductive rights. Now, for example, people in France were so appalled at overturning the right to abortion in the US in 2022 that they actually changed the French Constitution to guarantee that right in France. Certainly Europe is not perfect, and we have read of horrific cases arising in Europe. But in many ways, they remain ahead of the United States. Many European nations have made progress in increasing political representation of women in parliament and in other decision-making positions. As we well know, the US has never had a woman president. Fully a third of Europe's 50 countries have had a woman leader. Now people in Europe decry that it's only a third. Oh my goodness, we have yet to have one. So with all of this, I get very inspired, shall I say, to think about what it is that I myself can do. And on an individual level, in connection with World Without Genocide, I was able to attend the Commission on the Status of Women, which was held March 10th through 21st at UN World Headquarters in New York. World Without Genocide has special consultative status with the UN, as Michelle mentioned. And this gives us the unique opportunity to attend the Commission on the Status of Women every year. And Randy Markuson and I have attended multiple years, almost always with young lawyers, with interns who work for us, and so on. Our goal is to have them become inspired, to take action, to preserve equality for women, to move forward with civil society, to advance social equality for all of us. And you see our delegation to the Commission on the Status of Women. It was the 69th Annual Commission. The opening remarks were given by Secretary General Antonio Guterres in the General Assembly at the United Nations, a truly awe-inspiring place to be. And the focus was on strategies to advance equality in this time of the backlash against gender. The agenda, sort of writ large, addressed the major areas of inequality that I've described: violence, poverty, discrimination, political exclusion, the lack of right to control one's body. And I came away from the week that we spent at the UN truly committed to speak out and to speak against what Secretary General Guterres labels the poison of patriarchy, and to stand up in my own small way against the masters of misogyny. And the facts are truly incontrovertible, what I've shared so far tonight. The US abridges the human right to bodily autonomy for women, girls, gender-expansive people, and other vulnerable groups. If we are beset with violence, unable to access health care, forced out and eliminated from education and the workplace, we become, as Michelle said, invisible and erased. So for me, I began thinking, how can I bring this issue to a somewhat new level? And this was the small answer for me. Every 4.5 years, each member state of the UN must be reviewed by the UN Human Rights Council. This is a group of 47 people representing UN member states. They're elected and they meet at the UN headquarters in Geneva, Switzerland. The UN has both headquarters in New York and in Europe. And this council, the Human Rights Council, conducts what is called a universal periodic review. Everything in the human rights world is an acronym, a UPR. So they conduct a UPR of every member state. And the review includes 3 documents. First, the state's own prepared report, what it says about its own efforts to move human rights forward. A summary of past reviews by the Human Rights Council, and then something called a shadow report. And this is cool. Shadow reporting is an important tool for non-governmental organizations like World Without Genocide, like the League of Women Voters, in supporting human rights. An NGO can submit a shadow report pointing out where the state, where the government, in this case, where the United States might be misleading the UN committee from seeing the truth, from seeing the full picture of what is going on. So what did we do at World Without Genocide? We organized a coalition of 6 national organizations, all of us committed to social justice, to equality, to women's bodily autonomy. And we wrote a shadow report. We submitted it to the UN Human Rights Council. This is the cover of our report. The report is on our website. And the Human Rights Council will review the United States on November 5th at UN headquarters in Geneva, Switzerland. Representatives of our 6 organizational member coalition will be there to lobby in person to raise the important issues that we document in our report. And many of those issues are the ones that I have shared with all of us this evening. We know that our report won't move the administration in the White House, but it will be a moment of what is called naming and shaming on a public stage. It is an opportunity for us to speak out and to speak up about the outrageous backlash against women by the masters of misogyny to strengthen their poison of patriarchy to try to bring back a man's world. This will be a moment for us to highlight in print, in social media, in whatever form we can, that a small organization and its 5 partners are raising awareness at the highest possible level in the world about efforts to erase women's equality. I've described a terrible situation. In 2021, the United States was included for the first time on an annual list of backsliding democracies published by the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, 2021. However, there's been notably little conversation about the fact that our abysmal record on gender equality is really the harbinger for our downgraded status on democracy. That inequality for women, girls, and so on is the canary in the coal mine. Deeper inequality for women leads to wider gaps in political participation and even more backsliding, a truly vicious cycle. The V-Dem democracy indices show significant declines from 2016 to 2020. In March 2025, last month, its director said, and I almost hate to say these words aloud, the US was on track to lose its democracy status in 6 months. In 2025, Dr. Stephen Levitsky, a Harvard political scientist, found that the first 2 months of the current administration to be the most aggressively and openly authoritarian case of democratic backsliding that he has seen, expressing particular concern about attacks on the courts. A sense of racial threat appears to be one of the main drivers in some of the states in the United States. Unified Republican Party control shows greater backsliding than in states that do not have that. Some of the worst performing states in terms of democracy are Alabama, Tennessee, Ohio, Wisconsin, and North Carolina. Larger factors are economic inequality, and we know that with current policies that is becoming worse. The nationalization of state politics through declining local and regional journalism, and an increase in national donors. These are further contributions towards the backsliding. One of the most troubling legislative efforts is the SAVE Act. It stands for Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act. Again, all these acronyms. It's already been passed in the US House of Representatives, and there's great concern that it could affect voting for millions of married women in particular, those who have changed their last names. I'm one of them. The reason is that the bill requires people to prove US citizenship before registering to vote. Acceptable documents include a birth certificate, a US passport, nationalization paperwork, and certain versions of the real ID that indicates citizenship. But as many as 69 million American women have taken on their spouses or former spouses' last name, and their birth certificates no longer match the names they use today. And meanwhile, more than half of all Americans don't have a passport. So it could be harder for married women to vote. In addition, for elderly, ill, rural, and disabled people, it may be impossible for them to try to provide these documents. So what can we do? We must stand up and speak out against this measure. We also must lobby to safeguard many services and laws that I've spoken about this evening. They are threatened or, in fact, disabled already. Head Start, AmeriCorps, and the Peace Corps. Social Security, the IRS, public libraries, public TV, public radio systems. All the laws that protect workers' rights. Services for those who have been abused. Services that protect our food supply, and so much more. I want to share something that I read very recently. I'm sure you're all familiar with Project 2025. Paul Dans, an author of Project 2025, which is the mega manifesto, was asked by Politico to assess the Trump administration's progress in enacting Project 2025's agenda, which is truly quite authoritarian and nationalistic as a roadmap for the US. And Dans was quite euphoric. And he said, and I quote, "It's actually way beyond my wildest dreams." Way beyond my wildest dreams, he said. And then I was reading The Atlantic magazine, the issue that just came out this past week. And Atlantic reporter David Gans writes, "Thinking about Project 2025 as simply a laundry list of management tweaks and policy proposals is a mistake. The authors of 2025 set out to turbocharge the Trump administration and reshape the executive branch, but their ambitions are much bigger. Their goal is to transform American society in their image. And I've shared this evening what that image involves. So far, everything is going according to plan, according to the plan he's talking about for Project 2025. And I find that very chilling. And I want to explain why. I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but the month of April in the state of Minnesota is Genocide Awareness and Prevention Month. And April 24th was Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day. And I've been speaking about issues related to World War II and so on quite a bit for this past month. And in particular, I have been quoting a statement that was made in March 1933, just 3 months after the Nazis took power in Germany. Again, I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but the coincidence with Mr. Gantz's remarks was quite upsetting to me. Joseph Goebbels, who was the Nazi minister of propaganda, said 3 months into the Nazi regime, so about 100 days, The authority of the Führer has now been wholly established. Votes are no longer taken. The Führer decides. All this is going much faster than we had dared to hope. Again, perhaps merely coincidental. But the message for all of us is that this is going much faster than we have feared. What is going faster? The erosion of democracy, the erosion of equality for women, the harbinger, the canary in the coal mine for the dismantling of democracy. And it really is time for us to step on the brakes with our full energy and our full power, and to stop the decline of democracy, and to stop the further erosion of women's rights, of our erasure, of our invisibility, of our human right to our own autonomy. I say to people that the time is now, but the time is always now. Thank you very much for this opportunity to be with you this evening. And now I welcome Michelle and Randy for a conversation.
Thank you both. Before we begin our discussion, just a reminder, please put your questions in the Q&A function. We'll get to as many of them as time allows. Also, feel free to contact the League or World Without Genocide if you have questions that come to mind later, or if you have any comments. Michelle, thank you for your leadership on these critical issues and for telling us more about the League's role in protecting women's rights and democracy. Ellen, you presented us with alarming information on the threats to our democracy and how those threats are linked to the backlash against women's rights and autonomy. The Secretary General's remarks on the poison of patriarchy and the masters' misogyny should concern us all and serve as a call of action. So, Ellen, could you talk more about the speed at which democracy, and especially women's rights, are eroding, and does this surprise you?
I think that's a great question, Randy. And I want to go back to the fact that in 1979, women were already outnumbering men in college. We saw the results of the civil rights movement of the 1960s that also led us to a remarkable and powerful and wonderful women's movement. So our efforts to move forward truly began back with people advocating for women to have the right to vote a long, long time ago, but we really gained great speed in the 1960s. So I think that the progress that we made, Randy, has been in effect now really for 60 years. And it has been a backlash that has been evolving during that time. I think it feels more rapid now because we're seeing such a plethora of executive orders that are affecting women, girls, and so on in all areas of our lives all at once, so rapidly in 101 days. But I think that the trajectory has been there as a threat by some, a threat to the man's world.
Michelle, the next two questions are for you, and they're related. The League has a long history of promoting and protecting democracy. Who is the League for?
Great question. As we say, the League of Women Voters, people will, I've had someone just ask me at our lobby day, can men join? Yes, we are for all genders, and actually all ages from 16 on up can officially be a member of the League of Women Voters. And we are being a 100+ legacy organization, keep women in our name, but also because women have yet to gain parity and really almost, in any, we have not gained parity in almost any organizational setting. So we are absolutely here for everyone who, again, wants to be a part of building that, inclusive democracy that we work to bring forward. We, especially in the who are we for and the who we work for, is the same from when we started. It's okay, whose rights are being challenged, right? Women fought for the right to vote, not for the privilege of voting, but for the justice they wanted to do. And so we, like now in these days, well, for many, many years, we were very involved and still do all the voter registration of newly naturalized citizens and helping people become citizens. When the league was founded, they had citizenship schools. So at the heart of it is teaching people how our democracy works, how we participate in it. So we definitely are there for people who want to continue the democracy, which is ruled by the Constitution and the rule of law. And the Constitution itself has changed a lot. And I think that's a big part of kind of the other part of this equation, Randy, if I can go just one more step further into this, because I think we have to remember that, you know, um, we took the position, the league studies positions, and then we take consensus on it and vote on them, and then we can act on them. We know Roe v. Wade was in the 70s, 1983. We had our own position on reproductive health. So women worked a long time, but there were another group of women who worked for a long time to overturn Roe v. Wade, and they were successful, right? So there's different people living in our country. We have been consistently, as a country and in a democracy, a group of diverse people. I mean, the Constitution itself is an exercise in diversity, equity, and inclusion. We have consistently added more rights to people as we become better informed and more engaged. But I think we have to also realize that having rights doesn't necessarily mean that everyone takes them. And that's one of the phenomenon that I think we have to really look at as voters right now in America. We know exactly what the Trump administration is. People know exactly Project 25, everything that's happening was absolutely known to everyone. And yet the Trump administration not only won, fair and square, but also won the popular vote this time. And so there were a lot of people in that intermediary who felt like something was off for them, right? So I often say, when people will say, oh, aren't you some sort of leftist organization? A lot of times because we take positions on issues, our issues have stayed the same pretty much in a lot of ways for decades, but the partisan take on the issues haven't. And so when you look at how do we really embody an inclusive democracy where I like to say where everyone belongs. I've kind of moved into this concept of a web, using those acronyms again, where everyone belongs. There are a lot of people in this country who don't feel that they belong, and they made different choices. And that included, again, we have the most expansive voting rights ever here in the state of Minnesota. We enacted 32 new voting law rights. It is so easy to vote. It just is in the state of Minnesota. At least I can speak for. And yet we still lost voters by the tens of thousands. People didn't vote. We saw the lack of turnout, especially Black men, a lot of Latinx community, young people. Our young people 18 to 24, even though we're working very hard on that, still vote almost 20% less than the general public. So while we're also working really hard on legislation and rights, we also have to think about, how winning the hearts of people too, and the minds. Where are we? How are we helping our communities feel more connected? And I think that's it's a bigger question, but so the who we're for is always consistently been the people whose rights are most challenged. But what I see now is also we have to also now dip into why are people not choosing to exercise their right to vote, which we fought so hard for? So there's a lot of complex questions there.
The second question, you answered part of it in your answer. What does the league do to get young people more involved?
Yeah. Well, we have lots of things. We work in partnership. Almost all our work is in partnership. And we've really enjoyed in the last couple of years working with the YMCA Center for Youth Voice. We work with the Secretary of State's office, our AAUW chapters, and our leagues are really active in high schools. We did a big push this last year for National Voter Registration Day and got almost 25% of high schools to participate because it's the first time that students can pre-register to vote. And so 16 to 17-year-olds can now pre-register to vote. And why that's so significant is that while I was telling you kind of the depressing, 20% less of young people voting, the upside is when young people are registered to vote, they vote closer to that 80% mark. So it's really important. So we've really, we just had our lobby day the other day. We had several young people speaking, and it's always the piece that, brings tears to my eyes, realizing this is the why, right? This is the why we do this work. And I think the other piece of working with young people, and we have to continue to remind them, it's a challenge in the world of Snapchat and instantaneous world, right? Like I was an activist in the 80s, when we had our illegal wars in Central America and apartheid, and that's where my arrest record started, right? And but a lot of them we've had a fairly calm, era peace in the last, since in these later years. And a lot of them have not yet experienced the challenges that kind of dissension and, war and outbreak, the things that Ellen's talking about, um, you know, in the same way. And so a lot of people feel like, well, I often will say, well, it took 72 years for women to get the right to vote. How many of you will volunteer to get involved if you know it might take 72 years to get done? And no one raises their hand, of course, right? So I think that it's so important still for all of us as we're involving youth to remember our own role as storytellers. I mean, I think Ellen does a beautiful job of that. And all of us this is why our history and our civics is so important. And you see the passion of that. We work very hard on getting the new legislation passed in Minnesota, which now has a civics credit that's required in 11th and 12th grade to align with voting, because we know that civic participation is key. And young people are not joiners like the older, joining and being part of communities where not everyone, when you join the bowling league and you join neighborhood groups, people were mixed up in their ways of, who they were. And that sort of joining isn't happening so much anymore. And so I think it's so great to hear from and immobilize young people, but don't also forget our own opportunity to tell our own story. I feel that older people, okay, because I'm 62, I feel that, but I see the value. It's the same way when we talk about things like the Holocaust. We don't want to lose those stories. We don't want to lose that perspective. But that is really true that all of us have an opportunity to continue to influence people around us about what they can do. So That's, we're excited about young people, and I've been really happy with how excited they've been to be with us. They need us. And it's our responsibility too to not just hand them this really scary world, And so I also try to always bring the hope in because, I can see myself, well, I got another 20 good years left, or whatever we say to ourselves, right? And they're like, they've got a lifetime. And so when we're talking about this world as scary as it can be, we have to also remind them of, you know what? Hey, the bottom line though is you have power, and power, individual power, has always made the difference in changing the world. And I think we have to inspire that in people at the same time as we're delivering the bad news.
Ellen, this is a long question. I'll read it carefully, but I think it's an important one. You mentioned the great history of women's movements and advocacy for women in Europe. One thing I struggle with in the US nowadays is feeling that there is a partitioning of women's issues and men's issues. I've seen articles stating men had a surge of support for Trump in the last election. I'm wondering if you are noticing anything in the US that works effectively for, lack of a better word, of caring about women's rights.
I think the most important thing that we have to acknowledge is that we must build partnerships. And Michelle is alluding to that as well. And to say these are women's issues, these are men's issues, whatever we do to divide us harms all of us ultimately. One of the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations focuses on building partnerships and building collaboration. And it is only through that kind of recognition of the true diversity with our broader society and engagement with that diversity that we will develop the strength to go forward with social justice for all of us. We have to acknowledge that. So women's organizations have to ally with other organizations that may not be only women's organizations. We need to reach out and find organizations whose mission, whose framework, whose values regarding social justice, peace, security, protections for the most vulnerable among us resonate with every one of us. Only then are we going to create a society that is truly moving towards what I call sustainable peace. Otherwise, we have these polarizations, this violence that is tearing us apart right now, that we see in epidemics of gun violence with people shooting people they are labeling the other in terrible ways. We must be cohesive, collaborative, embracing in the work that we do.
And if I can add, because it's a perfect timing, if you see that it is what's happening now, what is the solidarity among groups, is that when Harvard said, no, we will not be bullied into changing, and other schools jumped in, right? I mean, this is the time we need to be brave. People need to lead, they need to jump in, and people see that and they go with them. Now, hundreds of universities have said that, right? Together, we are going to be so much stronger. And so nonprofits, a lot of us are signing and saying, hey, if one nonprofit's 501c3 status is challenged inappropriately, we're there with you. This is no longer about them, they, that world over there. It's all of us. And history has consistently shown, it's like they say, no democracy movement has failed when just 3.5% of the population, which is 11.5 million Americans, mobilizes, and the keyword is persists. I mean, that's really that's doable. I think, okay, we have 1 million, members and supporters in the League of Women Voters, and don't we know 11 people? Come on, each one of us. So We absolutely have to just seize the power of that and pull together. And part of that is then the resistance is, the marches, all those things. But what Ellen is saying, and what Ellen and I work on in our organizations a lot, is sort of this third level of being strategic too. Sometimes people will say, well, I didn't see the league's logo on this or that. And it's like, we're also strategic about where we're going to be when, because when you look at legislatively, the margins are paper thin, right? In the state, they're really paper thin, 67 in the House, right? But again, if only 3 people in the US House of Representatives had voted against the budget, it would not have come. So the whole idea of Medicaid right now, and almost $1 trillion of possible loss, had we convinced 3 people to vote no, it wouldn't have passed. So that's how tight these margins are, meaning we have to get strategic. Part of that in Minnesota right now, we have 27 GOP members of the Minnesota legislature who wrote a letter to their GOP, to the US representatives, GOP, and said, please don't cut Medicaid. So we are thanking them. We had one of them, Representative Nadeau, speak at our lobby day. We cannot also be othering everyone. We need to find friends. We need to find allies. They should be from every walk of life right now. And it is happening. Remember in that Project 2025, every single thing, 200 lawsuits are pending. So while these things are out there, while the language is starting, while the unraveling is happening, it's not that it isn't serious, but it is being challenged. And we must persist.
I want to add something to this as well, and that is we are talking about rights that we have. And I fear that sometimes we forget that they must be acted upon actively to be preserved. They do not exist without our support, without our commitment, without our eyes on them at all times, because they can easily be eroded. And all of a sudden we wake up one day and that right is gone. That right is just gone. So our full attention must always be paid to these rights that have been hard won over time. They must be protected. They must be safeguarded through our collaboration and through a strong civil society. Democracy is only as strong as the civil society that stands up for it. And this is our mission. World Without Genocide is a 501c3, just like the League. We can collaborate. We can work together in building a framework, in building that forward momentum to safeguard rights for all. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights has an important word: universal. Those rights that are aspirational for every single person on this planet. And that's what we have to remember.
Thank you, Ellen. Michelle, I'll turn it over to you for closing thoughts.
Well, I've said a lot already, and I think that the one piece that the hopeful part is we really do all have a role to play. And it isn't that it doesn't need to be, you don't need to, if you don't want to go to a rally or you don't want to write a letter, all of us have someone in our life that we can influence, difficult conversations, things we can say, something you post on Facebook, or just, again, being kind to people in your neighborhood, helping people out, being a role model for what civil society looks like right now can be equally powerful. So I think that's the bottom line there is we all have to realize that we play that role and that we can't get in a blame and shame game right now. We need to assume everybody wants democracy and we need to work together to get them there.
Thank you, Ellen. Thank you, Michelle. And thank you to all the participants. And have a good evening.
Bye-bye.
Join the League.
Take action. Yes, we have a great take action page on our website. We meet for our Fired Up Fridays every Friday. That would be tomorrow. So every week we do meet to try to help people identify what the actions are that they can do. So join us on Friday, lwvmn.org. You'll get all the info. Keep following World Without Genocide and Ellen's great work. Ellen, I can't wait to hear about the shadow report. We'll have to do this again and learn
Thank you.
more. Yeah, that'll be great.
Thank you.
Thank you.